on to slide 3, and we'll look at some of the factors that influence PM2.5 levels. So first, I draw your attention to the left side of the screen. So this is pretty obvious, right? Emissions are very important for PM2.5. And emissions can come from a wide variety of sources: combustion sources, on-road, off-road, stationary sources, wildfires, for example, a very large source of PM2.5, fireworks. Some of the highest days of the year for PM2.5 levels occur on the 4th and 5th of July. So emissions are very important. However, meteorology, which are the other 4 images on the right side of the screen, is also very important. So mixing and ventilation. So atmospheric mixing, how much the air mixes with the upper atmosphere is very important influence on PM2.5 levels. So typically the surface of the earth is heated by the sun. You get warm air at the surface, and that warm air rises up through the atmosphere and it mixes the atmosphere. However, on certain days, you can get an inversion layer where you get this layer of warm air trapped above the surface. And since that's a very stable layer, because you have cold air below warm air, you don't get a lot of mixing with the upper atmosphere. So for the same amount of emissions, it gets trapped closer to the surface, leading to higher concentrations. So that's a really important factor in governing PM2.5 levels day to day. And then also ventilation of the basin. So we all know that on Santa Ana wind days, the basin looks extremely clear. And that's because we have really strong winds pushing all the PM out over the ocean, clearing everything up. So that the western side of the basin doesn't have mountains to interrupt the flow. Also, fog and humidity are very important for PM2.5. So a lot of our high days occur on foggy mornings. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that water vapor is really important for one of the processes that forms PM2.5 in the atmosphere. And then the other reason is that these particles can uptake some water, and there's some chemistry that can occur in cloud droplets, or fog droplets. Also, sunlight is important. So there's some processes that form PM2.5 in the atmosphere that need sunlight to occur. And then also the frequency and intensity of storms. So we all know that when storms roll into the basin, we get really good mixing and ventilation, but also rainfall has a significant effect. So rain droplets are a really effective way of cleaning PM2.5 out of the atmosphere. So as these rain droplets fall through the atmosphere, they hit the PM2.5 particles, they get absorbed into the droplet and then rained out. Okay, so now let's move on to the 2 main ways of getting PM2.5 into the atmosphere. So that's slide 4. So PM2.5 can either be directly emitted from sources, which is what we call primary PM2.5. So that sources like a lot of combustion sources where you can actually see a plume coming out. Wood smoke or meat cooking or, mobile sources or some stationary sources directly emit PM2.5 into the atmosphere. You can also form PM2.5 into the atmosphere, which is what we refer to as secondary PM2.5. And that's where you emit gas phase precursors. So things like evaporative emissions from fueling or consumer products or paints and coatings or VOCs from vegetation, or vehicle exhaust emits gases that get oxidized in the atmosphere to form secondary PM2.5. And in our region,
Mr. Epstein, we have 2 fairly new board members in the meeting this morning, sure, being Supervisor Bartlett and Mr. Rodriguez. And so, I think maybe I would suggest to you that, how long have you been at the district?
I've been at the district a bit over 6 years.
Okay, so you weren't here when we thought that PM10 was the major issue, right?
I think that was a bit before my time, but at least for the Coachella Valley.
And then it went down to PM5. right?
2.5.
Yeah.
No, it went down to 5. And then it went down to 2.5.
Okay.
Okay. So the question in my mind is, do we then, after 2.5, do we go to nanoparticles?
Phil, do you want to do that, or do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Dr. This is Phil. Hopefully I could address that. As you know, there's been a lot of work over the last decade on what you refer to as nanoparticles, also known as ultrafine particles, and these are particles roughly about a tenth the size of PM2.5, another factor of 10 smaller. And there's been a lot of work done on this, on the health effects. There's been a lot of work done on atmospheric chemistry and measurements. And yes, there is evidence that there are additional health effects that come from exposure to these even smaller particles. And in fact, that is why we went from PM10 down to the smaller sizes, as the health evidence kept mounting that the smaller the particle, the greater the health impacts. So because of that, EPA, the state have set standards at the smaller sizes. But at this point, neither EPA or California Air Resources Board have set standards for anything smaller than PM2.5. They've looked at it several times, but the evidence just isn't as great or as established as it is for PM2.5 at this point.
Do you think it will be?
I do think so. We're probably 5 to 10 years out. I would think that EPA themselves would probably set a standard for smaller particles. They've assessed it 2 or 3 times as they're looking at the PM standards and looking at what types of particles to regulate. And there's a bunch of literature. They came close last time in the proposal, but they said not yet. So I think in the next round, they just proposed this week that they're going to propose to stand pat on the current standards. But 5 years from now, they'll be looking at it again, and I think there's a chance that there will be some regulation of ultrafines at that point, depending on the administration and all those other factors.
So are you aware of the findings of the research that we've done through the Health Brain and Lung Foundation, whatever they're calling it these days?
Yes, absolutely, at Cedars as well as at UCLA and USC. And the one common theme in a lot of the ultrafine toxicity research is that the particles are so small that they translocate throughout the body. It's not just in the lungs, it's not just in your bloodstream. These particles can move, you could breathe them in and they can deposit in your nasal cavity and migrate straight to your brain without even going through your lungs. And there's a lot of research that shows that's true. These small particles have been found almost in every organ of the body. And again, the work at Cedars has highlighted what happens when those particles make their way into the brain and the nervous system.
And the unborn fetus?
As well, exactly.
So, and if we are to keep our role in the world as the leader in air pollution cleanup, don't you think that we ought to be talking about nanoparticles rather than 2.5, even though that 2.5 is the regulation?
Yeah, and we have in the past. We have looked at it we are looking at it in our MATE studies. We take measurements. We do look at trends. We've funded research. We obviously have not. It's usually not the local air district's role to set standards, but we have done that work and continue to do that work. I think as you'll see in the presentation, we are on the edge of attaining the PM 2.5 standards and being in attainment for PM 2.5 of all those standards. So I think you're right, the next frontier in PM regulation will likely be the smaller particle sizes.
So if we wait until EPA or CARB agrees with us that nanoparticles are destructive, how many people do you think die of that in the next 10 years?
It's very hard to say. Again, for PM 2.5, we have these well-established response functions, we call them, or what the health impacts are, the mortality rates are for certain levels of exposure, but we just do not have that for ultrafines yet. We have some really good toxicology results, but we don't have those epidemiology results that tell us exactly what.
That said,
Yeah.
that nanoparticles can accumulate in your nasal passages, also can be transmitted to unborn fetuses. So the number has got to be some kind of multiple of what we're currently seeing.
Dr. Burke, if I would just add that when we're looking at controlling these sources, part of what we're looking at is the emission profile. And by that, I mean, ultimately, we want to get to zero emissions. And if we get to zero emissions through the use of electric vehicle battery or fuel cells, the PM and the ultrafine PM isn't going to be as strong or as much of a problem as it is now. So I think that the strategy that we're using will ultimately address what you're getting at least for some of it. Certainly when we're looking at these pictures and you see the cooking, I know we're looking at trying to come up with rules for char broilers and things like that. But we're trying to move in that direction. Ultimately, zero emissions will get us where we need to be.
And if I can add, ultrafine particles, once they're in the atmosphere or formed in the atmosphere, they behave very differently. They don't, PM 2.5 can last in the air for, 2-3 days or up to a week, but ultrafine has a very short lifetime. It is a very different patterns, different behaviors. It would probably have to be regulated in a different way. But as Wayne said, almost all of our strategies to reduce PM 2.5 or to reduce NOx also reduce ultrafine particle emissions.
I appreciate that. But I don't think that we ought to set back on talking about it because we're working on a mission of the 2.5. I think that we need to keep talking about nanoparticles and not get hung up in we met the 2.5 requirements. I just don't think that that's the way to go. Anyway, I've spent too much of everybody's time, but that's just my opinion on that.
It's a good discussion. Thank you. Maybe Dr. Epstein can continue.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I was talking about the two main ways of forming PM 2.5 in the atmosphere, either directly emitting it or having gases be emitted and then those gases reacting in the atmosphere to form PM 2.5. And that's what we call secondary PM 2.5. And that's important in our basin. So roughly 2/3 of the PM 2.5 in our basin comes from secondary sources. Another interesting tidbit is that a lot of these sources, which I put on the primary part of this slide, actually also emit some gas phase precursors that form secondary PM 2.5. So for example, wood smoke emits PM 2.5 directly, and then also emits gases that get oxidized in the atmosphere to form PM 2.5. Okay, so now let's move a bit into the standards. So this is slide 5. So like I said, there's 2 standards we're working on attaining. This is the annual standard. So calculation of the annual standard is relatively straightforward. So you take your attainment year, which is in our case 2025, and you take the annual average at each station. And then you average that with the annual average in 2024 and 2023. So it's essentially a 3-year average is what we call the design value. And you do that for each station in the basin. And at the dirtiest station, you need to be at or below 12 micrograms per cubic meter. Okay, so what do our data look like? So why don't we move on to slide 6? Okay, so this plot is a bit busy, but bear with me here. So the y-axis, I'm showing the annual design value for PM 2.5. So this is a 3-year average, and then years on the x-axis. I put on the 2 standards, the 15 microgram per cubic meter standard, which you saw we attained, and the 12 microgram per meter cube standard, which we have a 2025 attainment year. And you can see the trend is pretty promising. So we've had over a 50% reduction since measurements began in the early 2000s. For a while, from 2008 to 2016, Mira Loma was our most polluted station. However, after near road monitors were installed, there's a near road monitor on the 60 freeway in Ontario. That became the most polluted station. So the trend is good news. Another piece of good news is that 2019, if you look at just the 2019 annual average, that was by far the cleanest year on record. So our single year average for 2019 was actually 12.6 micrograms per cubic meter. We think we're on track for attaining this standard by the attainment date. And that's due to a lot of NOx reductions that we're expecting to get for the ozone attainment strategy. Okay, and let's look at how this per station now. So let's go to slide 7. Okay, so now this is just looking at the 3-year average, 2017, 18, and 19 by station in the basin. So if you notice, 4 stations are above that dashed line that don't meet the standard. So that's the Near Road 60 monitor in Ontario, Mira Loma, Compton, and there's a Near Road monitor on the 710 in Long Beach. So those 4 stations, and those encompass 3 different counties. Okay, so let's look at this on a map now. So slide 8. Okay, so this is a map showing that data on the previous slide in map form. So you see that the highest concentrations of PM 2.5 typically occur in kind of urban metropolitan LA County, and then also the Inland Empire. And that's for different reasons. So urban metropolitan LA County has a lot of primary PM 2.5 sources, a lot of on-road sources. And then as you go further inland, there's a chance for more secondary chemistry to occur. So the inland locations have more secondary PM 2.5. Okay, so why don't we move on to slide 9? Okay, so just to summarize a little bit, our attainment status for the annual PM 2.5 standard. So the 2019 value is the lowest on record. Like I said, it was 12.6. In 2018, we exceeded the annual standard at 7 stations, but only 4 stations in 2019. Like I mentioned, the monitor in Ontario on the 60 freeway has had the highest annual average concentration over the past 4 years. We think we're still on track to attain the annual standard by 2025. And since monitoring began in the early 2000s, we've seen about a decrease of over 50%. Okay, so that's the annual standard. So now let's move on to the 24-hour standard, slide 10. Okay, so calculation of the 24-hour standard is a bit more complex. And the main take home from this is while the annual standard looks at every day equally, the 24-hour standard looks at the high days. And the way we do this is it's a 3-year average, like the annual standard. So our attainment year is 2019. So that means we look at 2019 data, 2018 data, and 2017 data. We do this for each station. And we take the 98th percentile for each year. So you look at all the days, you sort them, and you pull out the 98th percentile value. So what exactly does that mean? So there's this table on the bottom right showing the 98th percentiles. So some stations, we have filter measurements every day. And if we have filter measurements every day, the 98th percentile is the 8th highest value. If we have measurements every third day, it's the third highest value, and every sixth day, it's the second highest value. So an important thing to note from that is that you can have exceedances at a station and still meet the standard, because we're not necessarily looking at the highest recorded concentration. We're looking at the 98th percentile highest concentration. So what we do is we get that number for each year, we average it, and that is how we define the design value. That's what's compared to 35 micrograms per cubic meter. So the annual standard, any 1 or 2 days doesn't really affect the annual standard because it's averaged in 365 days. But the 24-hour standard, since it's looking at just those high days, a large difference in design value could be due to 1 or 2, extra high days. Okay, so let's move on to slide 11. Okay, so since we're talking about the 24-hour standard, we need to talk a bit more about exceptional events. So like I mentioned, a lot of the high days we see in a year are due to wildfires or fireworks on Independence Day. So there's a mechanism for removing data that occur on days where we have exceedances that are beyond our control. So we can't really regulate wildfires. So there's a mechanism to remove those days. So in order to do that, we have to make a demonstration to EPA, these long, 50-page reports, many months of work of scientific analysis to demonstrate to the EPA that the exceedance on that day was caused by the event that was beyond our control. And we wouldn't have exceeded if that event didn't occur. We have to show that the event was not controllable or preventable. And the event either has to be natural or a man-made event that's unlikely to recur at the same location each year. So if we can make this case, it will get, these demonstrations will presumably get approved by EPA, and then we can remove that day when we calculate our attainment of the 24-hour standard. Okay, so now let's take a look at exceedances in 2019. So let's move to slide 12. Okay, so this is 2019 data. This is how many days in each month we exceed the standard, 35 micrograms per cubic meter. So you can see 2019 was a very clean year, at least compared to historical data. We did have a couple exceedances in January, and then 4th and 5th of July, which occur every year. And then exceedances in November and December. So the majority of our exceedances do occur in the winter months due to cool, calm conditions that we can get on some days with some fog, and then also wood burning. Okay, so now we can look at this trend over the years. If we go to slide 13.
About half.
Good chance for me to drink my water.
How did we stop?
Yeah, is there an issue with the slides?
No, continue on. Can you still see the slides?
Yeah, I can. Great. Can we switch to
presentation.
slide 13?
Go ahead and continue your presentation.
Okay, I'm frozen on slide 12. Is everybody else?
Yeah, my screen is frozen at 12 too.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
there we
Oh,
go.
there we go.
There we go.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay, so I showed you 2019 values. This is a similar plot looking at values since 2000, number of exceedance days since 2000. And on the past slide, we looked at it by station. This is just looking at how many days we exceed the standard in the basin. So you have year down the left side, and then month across the top, and then we have a total column. So first thing to note with this total column is how much the number of exceedances have been reduced since the early 2000s. So in the early 2000s, we were exceeding the 24-hour standard over 100 days a year. Now we're down into the low or middle teens. Another thing to note is how much the exceedances occur really in the winter months in recent years. So really the majority of them occur in November, December, January, February, with the exception of 4th of July. And then any exceedances that kind of do occur outside those months, like in 2018, those typically are they still exceed the standard, but they're on the lower side. Another interesting thing is we put on the first 3 months of 2020. Now, the data is not directly comparable. Usually it's a bit of an overestimate because we have to use our continuous monitors. We don't have the filter-based measurements yet, and our attainment is based on our filter-based measurements. So for that part of this plot, we use the continuous measurements, and we're off to a fairly clean year in 2020 as well.
Dr. Epstein, just curious, why were those, other than July 4th, those other months more prevalent with the exceedances?
You mean the winter months, November, December, January, February?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's because we typically have very favorable meteorology for high PM 2.5. So that being like cool, calm, foggy conditions combined with a lot of wood burning can lead to those exceedances.
When you say wood burning, that's fireplace, not
That's
forest
fireplace.
fire.
Right, residential wood burning. Yep. Okay, so moving on to slide 14. Okay, so now let's look at how we did on 2019 in terms of concentration. So this is the single year value for 2019. So 2019 was another very clean year, as was 2018. So from these slides and forward, we've actually removed out any of the exceptional events, any events that we think we would be able to make a strong case to EPA that they were exceptional events. So you can see in 2019, the only station that was over the standard for this single year was Mira Loma, and it was just barely over the standard. So it's a matter of 1 or 2 additional days that brought us above the standard. Okay, so let's move on to slide 15. Of course, there we go. Okay, so that was 2019 single year value. Now let's look at the trend in the 3-year design value. So the 3-year average design value is what's compared to the standard to determine attainment. And you can see that once again, just like in the annual standard, we've seen a very, very significant decrease since the early 2000s in our design value. We kind of had a little bit of a local peak, local maxima around 2015, 2016, but we're down on track again to get closer and closer to this 35 or 35.4 microgram per cubic meter line. So for a while, Mira Loma was the highest station. And then starting in 2017, Compton and Mira Loma were tied as the highest station. And then in the past 2-3 year periods, Compton was the highest station. Okay, so let's move on to slide 16. Okay, so I mentioned multiple times that we're judged based on the 3-year average in annual 98th percentile concentrations. However, 2017 happened to be a relatively dirty year compared to 2018 and 2019, and that makes it so that we can't attain in 2019. However, if we just look at 2018 and 2019, our 2-year and take the 2-year average, so not the 3-year average, but the 2-year average, all of our stations are below the standard. So this doesn't really mean anything for attainment, but it does mean that if we include, assuming what happens in 2020, if 2020 was similar to what we saw in 2018 and 2019, we will attain the standard by 2020, by the end of this year. So, it's not great news that we did not attain the standard by the attainment date in 2019, but we're in really, really good shape to attain it in this coming year. Okay, so let's move on to a summary.
I've seen what was happening in 2017 versus the other two.
Yeah, so 2017, we had a few extra high days, actually predominantly in Compton, because Compton is actually driving our, is our highest station now. So we had a few extra high days in Compton, mainly during the holiday periods, which we attribute not completely. I mean, it was meteorologically driven, but there was a lot of wood smoke. We expect that we saw a lot of wood smoke during that period too, residential wood smoke.
In Compton?
In Compton, yeah. Yeah.
How do you explain a lot of wood smoke in Compton?
Well, so what we did is we have measurements. There's this wood smoke tracer called levoglucosan. And it's this compound that's really unique. It's really only comes from wood, right? It's from cellulose combustion. And we have measurements as part of MATES. So we have a year's worth of measurements. And we can, from those measurements, we can kind of estimate how much PM came from wood smoke. And then what we can do with that is we can train a model that is based on meteorology and then day of the week or time of the year. And then we can run that model into the past. So we can make estimates.
I got that part. But you're saying that people in Compton are burning wood in fireplaces?
Well, Dr. Burke, if I can add, it doesn't necessarily mean the people in Compton burning the wood, but it could be getting transport. The other thing that was happening at the beginning of 2017, it was there were a lot of wildfires. There was some influence from wildfires, although probably not enough to make an exceptional event claim. And because of that influence, that marker that we talked about for wood burning also shows up in wildfires. So it's not 100% clear exactly what led to it, but some type of wood burning was a big part of it. It was we hadn't seen that before at Compton, 2017, January 1st, and there was one other day where we got these really high levels. We've done a lot of investigation. It hasn't reoccurred in 2018 or 2019. It was just something very unusual in 2017.
Didn't happen.
Okay.
Yeah, and maybe actually, can we flip to slide 27 just briefly? I have a good slide to show you in my backup slides. So here, this is all the data in Compton in 2017. And you can see, so if you look at this bottom plot, this is all the data throughout the year. And at the time, Compton, I believe, was every third day. So that means the third highest value determines, is the value that matters for that year. So you can see the third highest value is pretty high, right? So really we want to be careful to not overinterpret too much, just because it's really the difference of one or two bad days that could, make this 2017 value go from 53 down to, 38.
It's hard for me to imagine that there's enough wood burning fireplaces in Compton that are lit on any given day to cause an impact. Now, that may just be me, but, I spent a lot of time in Compton.
Yeah, but it's also, the monitor is located in Compton, but anything upwind can contribute.
Okay, so
not
what's upwind?
Upwind of the monitor. Right.
So what's upwind?
Well, the predominant wind direction comes from the west when we have these events. So cities to the west and the coast.
Can you name those?
Directly west.
It's okay.
I would.
Never mind.
Scott, I have a question, Chairman Burke.
Yes, Ms. Bartlett, Supervisor Bartlett.
Thank you, Chair. So with regard to slide number 16, I'm noticing it's the 2-year average for those particular stations, cities and stations. How are the stations, what is the criteria for locating a station in a particular city? What criteria so for instance, in my county, I have Mission Viejo and Anaheim. So what is the criteria that AQMD uses for putting a station in a particular city for these purposes?
Scott, do you want me to, this is Phil, I can address that?
Sure.
So a lot of it is historical. Some of these stations have been there for decades, and they were put in response to for various different reasons. Some were because a new standard was set, say PM 2.5 in the year 2000, and we needed to put out a PM 2.5 network. And some have been moved around over time to capture certain things. We want to make sure we're getting measurements that are representative of what people are being exposed to throughout the basin. There's a whole set of criteria that US EPA requires us to look at in locating stations. But one of the reasons that I'm talking about it historically is once you have a station in a certain location, for whatever reason it was put there, 20, 30 years ago, it's very important to try to keep that station so you have a continuous record of the trends. Because even if you move that station, a few miles away, there might be some different conditions there, so you break the ability to be able to analyze the trends. So they're chosen to try to pick out the high areas. They're chosen to try to pick out, some of the upwind areas. They're chosen to get some geographical diversity and some wide coverage. And now we have stations chosen to be near roadway, and when those were chosen to be near the busiest heavy-duty roadways. There's a variety of reasons. There's actually something called a network assessment that is done every 5 years for EPA, where we look at all our stations and reassess our entire network to see if adjustments need to be made. So it's a long answer, but a lot of it's historical, and a lot of it is to help us do our work to understand the air quality issues.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I understand. I don't see Ron on the meetings, but I understand we're having a problem being hacked right now.
So Dr. Burke?
Yes, there's Wayne.
Yeah, I just kind of said we're having some technical challenges, but we're going to leave these slides on the screen. And so once Scott is done with the presentation, we'll just continue, but have the last slide up, and we're okay for now. But after this meeting, everybody will have to disconnect and reconnect for the stationary source committee meeting. That'll allow us to make some adjustments and to make sure we don't have problems moving forward.
Okay. Then let's continue.
Okay, can we move to slide 17? Okay, and we already talked about this, so let's go to a general summary, slide 18. Okay, so what are the policy implications here? So our data, our filter-based measurements indicate that we're not going to attain the 24-hour standard by our deadline in 2019. So the following things are expected to happen. So one is that EPA is going to issue us a notice of failure to attain sometime this summer. This is going to trigger a contingency measure in our Rule 445 wood burning devices that we're currently working on amending. We'll be required to do a SIP revision showing annual reductions in PM 2.5 and also its precursors by more than 5% each year until we attain the standard. And then this SIP revision will also have to include additional feasible measures. Okay, slide 19. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up this part of the presentation, so 2019 was the cleanest year on record when we look at the annual PM 2.5 3-year design value. We didn't attain the 24-hour standard, but we're in pretty good shape for next year because the last 2 years would meet the standard if it was a 2-year average. I showed you that Compton has the highest 24-hour PM 2.5 concentrations, and then the near road site on the 60 freeway in Ontario has the highest annual PM 2.5 concentrations. And then also a take-home point, which I hope I motivated at the beginning, but attainment of the standards, especially the 24-hour standard, which is just looking at a few days, is really dependent on meteorology, how often we have these kind of humid and cold conditions in the winter that favor formation of PM 2.5. And then on the flip side, how often we have storms roll into the basin and kind of clean everything out. Okay, so maybe we can move to slide 20. So slide 20 is starting to talk about.
Before you leave that slide, I'd like to ask Wayne a question.
Yes, sir.
When we were last in Compton at the community meeting, the last one I was at,
Yeah.
is this PM 2.5 caused by the emitters that we were looking at that time?
So I believe the last time when we were there for a 617 meeting, and we were looking at some of the localized issues, and we were talking about what was going on in Paramount. And so,
Right.
yeah, most of that would have been the toxics issues, not necessarily the 2.5.
That's what I was getting at. I haven't. This is all new to me. Compton is the king of the 2.5. I feel like I've neglected my job here. How could I have not known this?
Well, I think as what we've seen is that there's been a shift in the highest reading in terms of the 2.5 in the area of focus. And so in this particular rush, what we've seen is Compton is there, but we've been really working to try to get a lot of the wood burning and areas like that down. And that's why we felt that we would see the downward trend that we're seeing. And as Scott noticed, last year was the best year ever, and we're getting really close to it. So we're doing the right things. We're getting it where it needs to be. And part of it is just like you've always said, Dr. Burke, public education and outreach, and making sure that people know during the wood burning season that we try to keep things low. We look at those no burn days and things like that.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So maybe we should field questions on this part of the presentation now, because the next 3 slides are looking at air quality implications from COVID-19. So maybe this time.
Scott, this is just in the interest of time, so we don't run into stationary. Maybe you should just finish up, and we'll take questions on everything.
Okay, great. Okay, so slide 20. Okay, so this has been all over the media, and I know that there's a lot of interest in looking at the air quality effects of COVID-19. So the first thing we did, we've been working on this for the past few weeks pretty intensively. So the first thing we did was we looked at the effect on vehicle emissions. So Caltrans maintains this network of roughly 9,000 sensors throughout our basin that are embedded in freeways. So we pulled in all this data and analyzed the light duty and heavy duty flow from these sensors. I kind of aggregated them all. And that's what these plots show on the right. So I normalized them so that a typical hour and day of the week was set to 100%. Right? So you see that the traffic flow is relatively typical up until you get to March 10th, 11th time period, where we start seeing a reduction in both light duty and heavy duty flow. So if you look at this weekly moving average, it's sort of around a 1/3 reduction in light duty vehicles on the freeways and roughly a 20% reduction in heavy duty vehicles. So
there are a lot of people that find that hard to believe. I haven't been out of the house in 15 days, so I don't know what the streets look like. But with the total shutdown of California, how do you only get a 1/3 reduction in auto traffic? It's just beyond me.
So
Bill,
Dr.
do you
Burke,
want to take that, or do you want me to?
I think it did surprise us as well, because I have been out a few times and it does look like a lot less traffic. So a couple caveats here. One, this is just on freeway, I believe.
Right.
So side streets may have a different pattern. So this is just freeway traffic. But it is based on actual data. These are sensors embedded in the roadway that count cars and count trucks going by. So although it's hard to believe, this is what we saw throughout the basin, and maybe it's going to continue to drop
You need
beyond
to
this.
call Caltrans and ask them to explain it to you. And then let me know, okay? Because this is so totally out of line with everything that is common sense that it just doesn't make sense.
I think one thing that people might also be experiencing is a third reduction in traffic is enough to make the freeways flow really fast and not have any kind of backups. So even though you might only have a third reduction, the speeds are so much higher, it may seem like it's even emptier than it actually is. That might be one effect. I will say on the heavy duty side, the demand for goods across the country and our goods movement industry, it's probably dropped some, but people are still getting deliveries to their homes, even more so. People are still buying things.
That I agree with, no problem, but only a 33% in light duty vehicles is just beyond me.
We'll talk to Caltrans and see what they have to say about that.
Yeah.
Okay. So we can use this activity data to kind of look at our emissions inventory very qualitatively to try and get a rough ballpark of how much emissions have gone down. So, so we can adjust the on-road emissions with this data. And then what we did is our emissions teams went through the other sectors and made kind of very rough ballpark estimates for how much they could have potentially gone down, to kind of come up with just a very rough sense for what order of magnitude reduction in emissions we expect to see during this period. So I want to just be very clear, these numbers are not quantitative numbers, they're just rough order of magnitude. And they show that depending on pollutant, we expect somewhere between 10 and 20% decrease in emissions. But once again, very, very rough numbers. So if we move on to slide 21, so then the question becomes are we able to see, how easy will it be to see improvements in air quality due to a 10 to 20% reduction in emissions? And we all know that air quality has been very clear lately. We actually had a stretch of clean air that was one of the longest we've seen since we started taking measurements. That stretch actually started before the Safer at Home orders and the reduced economic activity began. But the reason why that started before was because we've had this really long stretch of kind of frequent storms, winds, really high inversion layers. Not that we have had a lot of rain, but it's not necessarily the quantity of rain, it's how often we have these storms rolling into the basin. And meteorology is really important for PM2.5 concentrations. So we can typically, from day to day, with very similar emissions, have changes in concentrations on 90%. We could have a doubling in concentration as you go from one day to the other, just based on the meteorology. So this makes it really hard to observe changes on the order of 10 to 20% with this background signal of meteorology driving very, very large changes. So in order to draw quantitative conclusions from this, we have to remove these meteorological factors using models, which we're working very hard to do, and we're getting really close to doing. However, it's not quite ready for prime time. Or you can look at a very, very long time frame. And over a long time frame, these meteorological changes kind of average out over the years, and you can draw conclusions that way. But at least for this presentation, what I've done is I've compared concentrations during this COVID-19 period with what we've seen in the past 5 years. So there's two plots on the right side here. So the upper plot is the highest PM2.5 concentration, and the lower plot is the highest NO2 concentration. And we know NO2 is a precursor to not only PM2.5, but also ozone. And the blue and the red show the concentrations that we actually recorded this year. So you see PM2.5 has gone down, and so has NO2. But we can then compare that to the 5-year average. So that's shown in the gray plot, which is kind of right behind it. So you see PM 2.5 on average is highest in the winter. January and February kind of goes down. This time of year is pretty clean time for PM 2.5. And then also NO2 is higher in the winter months due to meteorology and sunlight, and that declines. So we have seen since the COVID period and even a bit before then, concentrations that are below what we've seen for the average concentration over the past 5 years. I also looked at the kind of the bounds, like the extent of those, the minimum and maximum concentrations we've seen in a 5-year period, kind of close to that date. So that's what that gray bar is. So essentially, we pick a date, April 1st, the top of that gray area shows what the maximum value we've seen within 15 days of April 1st in the past 5 years. And then the bottom part of the panel is the minimum value we've seen within the past 5 years. So basically concentrations of PM 2.5 and NO2 have kind of hovered around the lower extent of what we've seen in past years. And actually on some days we've been a bit below what we've seen in the past 5 years. So we're still trying to quantify the actual impact on concentration, but this is what we know for sure. Okay, so if we move to the last slide, so this is slide 22. So what effects does this have on attainment? So we think there's a possible impact on attainment of the annual PM 2.5 standard. However, we don't think this will help us at all with the 24-hour standard. And the reason why is because the 24-hour standard, like I said, is based on the highest values, which occur during the winter months. Unless this economic slowdown and reduced emissions continue well into these winter months, we're not expecting to see an impact on the 24-hour standard. We think there's a possible impact on the 8-hour ozone standard. The 8-hour ozone standard is dependent on the 4th highest values, which are typically occur during the peak summer months, May through September. If emissions are reduced during that period, we may have lower 8-hour ozone values, resulting in a lower ozone design value. However, we still expect to see ozone exceedances throughout the ozone season. The magnitude of emission reductions are not enough to eliminate them completely. And actually, so far throughout this year, we've already seen 2 exceedances, which is sort of typical for this time of year. So that's all I had. So I guess we can address any questions.
And you've used all our time.
So I guess there's no time for questions.
Well, I'm sure if there's any questions, we'll be glad to field them, but we're going to have to yield to the stationary source in a few moments.
We actually have a bit of time, Dr. Burke. Stationary source starts at 10:30.
Oh, 10th. Oh, great. I thought it started at 10. Then we can move. Are there any questions?
Yes, Dr. Burke.
Yes.
Just a comment.
Hello.
With all of this data that we're getting due to this shutdown of the economy, and we don't know exactly how long it's going to continue, can we use this data that we're getting and sort of fine tune our model for the ozone model, and see if our strategy on the NOx is really working?
So this is Mayor McCallum, this is Phil. I think that's an excellent point, and I've made that point in some of the press inquiries we've had, is that this does provide, if it continues throughout the summer and we can get a good handle on the emissions changes, it does provide kind of a natural experiment to help calibrate our models to make sure we're capturing all the chemistry correctly and all the meteorology correctly. So you're absolutely right. That's one of the reasons we've already started this type of analysis. And if this continues through our ozone season and we do see lower ozone, this will definitely help us validate or adjust our models if things should behave like we predict them to behave under these lower emission scenarios. And if they don't, that tells us something.
I think that's an excellent question. I think that we're going to be affected across the board coming out of this thing because nothing is going to be like it was before in the foreseeable future. So what we have deemed as paramount or the most important may in fact be adjusted in our priority schedule.
Yes, and Dr. Burke, this is Phil again. I think there's kind of two factors we need to think about. One is the immediate stay-at-home, less traffic that we're all experiencing now. But even when everyone goes back to work, if we go back to work in the same way, there could be longer-term economic impacts that will be a little bit more like a recessionary period that could last months or years even. So just like we did in 2009, 2010, we will have to track that closely.
Any other questions for Mr. Epstein? I don't have the hands up item on my screen, so hearing none, we'll then take the written reports by Dr. Fine on 2 and 3.
Do we need to do public? Are there any public comments? I don't see the hands raised either.
There's no public comment.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Those are just written reports, Dr. Burke.
Okay. Then is there any other business before the Mobile Source Committee? Is there any public comment for the Mobile Source Committee?
No hands raised, no public comment.
No public comment. Well, I hope everybody stays safe and stays quarantined until this thing is over. And I'll see you in the next meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you,
You
Dr.
too.
I just want to make sure that everyone knows that for the next meeting, you're going to have to disconnect and re-sign back in. So
We
thank you.
use the same link for each of the meetings, including technology at noon.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.